Hello and welcome everyone to Missouri Rural Crisis Center's webinar, Supply Management in the Time of Tariffs. My name is Jamie Blair and I will be facilitating today. This webinar will be recorded. We are going to start out by showing a short video from Wisconsin Farmers Union. Following that, we will have a brief Q&A with our panelists. Feel free to put your questions in using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and we will get to as many questions as we can. Before we get started, I would like to introduce our panelists. We have Tim Gibbons from Missouri Rural Crisis Center and Patty Livera from the Campaign for Family Farms and the Environment. Thank you both for being here today to help unpack this important subject. With that, I will start the video and then come back to you two for questions. You have to bear with me, folks. I've lost my cursor. There we are.
Imagine what thriving rural communities look like. Main streets lined with open businesses, schools filled with children, freshly paved roads, fast, reliable internet, clean water and air. Imagine lots of farms of different sizes scattered across the countryside, raising a variety of crops and animals using a variety of farming methods. Imagine a food system that balances the needs of everyone: farmers, workers, processors, distributors, and retailers, while providing nutritious food for every community. These are the kinds of communities most of us want, but in much of rural America, that isn't the reality. After decades of farm loss and generations of young people flocking to the cities, our small towns and villages are in disrepair. The good news is, we can bring our rural communities back to life. It starts with creating a stable and resilient family farm economy. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, the key challenge in agriculture was producing enough food to feed everyone. Then came technological advances in equipment, genetics, and chemicals that allowed farmers to squeeze more food out of each acre of land than ever before. These innovations kept coming, and between 1948 and 2015, agriculture production increased by a whopping 170%. On the surface, this seems like a great thing. More food production means more profit for farmers, right? Not exactly. The number of U.S. farms has been in steady decline for nearly a century, dropping from over 6 million in 1935 to just over 2 million today. Many of the farms that remained face mounting debt and lower levels of farm income than ever before. So what happened? The decline in the farm economy was caused in large part by runaway overproduction. These days, overproduction of food is as much of a problem as food scarcity. Every year, nearly 40% of food produced in the U.S. is wasted. Not only is this, wasteful, but it also causes environmental problems: soil erosion, groundwater depletion, landfills spilling over with rotting food, not to mention all the resources it took to produce that food in the first place. Overproduction is also a huge problem for farmers. When farmers produce too much of a commodity like milk, meat, or grains, the price they're paid for that commodity drops. Farmers respond to low prices and the need to regain that income by producing even more food. This floods the market and drives prices down further, forcing farmers to either borrow more money to keep expanding or go out of business altogether. Low prices from the marketplace also make farmers more dependent on government subsidies bankrolled by taxpayers, and the majority of payments are handed to the largest farms who overproduce the most. This has created a cycle that allows the big to continue getting bigger and push out smaller competitors. Other industries slow down production when there's a market surplus, but no individual farmer can stem the flood of surplus commodities. It takes collective action, farmers working together to balance supply and demand in agricultural markets. The concept of balancing food production to meet demand is not new. It was a cornerstone of New Deal-era farm policies that ensured farmers a fair price and helped the economy recover from the Great Depression. They worked by setting minimum prices for commodities based on the average cost of production. Grain reserves and cold storage kept surplus products off the market when prices were low, so they could be sold when prices were high. Land set-asides prevented surpluses and provided conservation benefits. The programs weren't perfect, but for a time, they brought real prosperity to rural America. During the late 20th century, price supports and supply management were slowly dismantled by an agribusiness industry that saw them as a barrier to their growth at all costs business model. These corporate giants benefit from overproduction because it allows them to pay the farmer less and keep more of the profit. They use that wealth to elect politicians who support their agenda. more exports, more production, and more subsidies to keep farmers quiet. In 1996, President Bill Clinton drove the final nail in the coffin when he signed the Freedom to Farm Act, terminating the last vestiges of New Deal supply management. Since then, commodity prices have swung wildly, and farmers have become increasingly dependent on government subsidies. In 2018, after nearly 4 years of low milk prices forced over 7,000 U.S. dairy farms out of business, Wisconsin Farmers Union brought supply management back into the spotlight. They started having conversations with dairy farmers about what it would take to improve prices and save the family dairy farms that were rapidly disappearing. Wisconsin Farmers Union launched the Dairy Together movement and set out to learn what an updated version of supply management could look like for U.S. dairy farmers. The group commissioned 2 dairy economists to research the impact supply management would have on the dairy industry. The results showed that had the program been implemented with the 2014 Farm Bill, it would have increased milk prices, doubled net farm operating income, significantly reduced government expenditures, and kept hundreds of dairy farmers in business. The impact on consumer prices would have been negligible, adding roughly 11 cents to the cost of a gallon of milk. And this is just one example. Imagine if this was applied to all commodities experiencing overproduction. So why don't we have supply management anymore? Because agribusiness corporations convinced farmers and politicians of the following myths. Number 1, an abundance of cheap food would benefit American consumers and reduce hunger. Unfortunately, surplus food doesn't equate to feeding more people. Remember these? These days, hunger is caused by poverty, not by food scarcity. So even though there's plenty of food on supermarket shelves, people go hungry because wages haven't kept pace with inflation. Some of the very same food processing and retail companies who are paying farmers so little also pay workers so little that they can't afford to feed their families. Myth number 2. Supply management is incompatible with feeding the world through exports. In reality, farmers and local food systems all over the world have been displaced by a flood of cheap commodities, contributing to poverty and food insecurity. It was never about feeding the world. It has always been about padding the pockets of the agribusiness industry. If we want to make sure the world is fed, our trade agreements must include fair wages for workers and pro-farmer policies like supply management. Myth number 3. Supply management means big government controlling farmers and our food supply. The truth? Farmers have become more dependent on government subsidies since the 1970s. Getting a fair price from the marketplace by balancing supply with demand actually makes farmers less dependent on the government. Rather than relying on taxpayers to bail farmers out when the market is flooded, we need Congress to create a program that prevents farmers from flooding the market in the first place. All these myths are just a smokescreen for the real reason that the government abandoned supply management. Big agribusiness corporations with well-funded lobbyists want to buy cheap commodities from farmers and sell them at a steep markup to consumers. And who's left to bear the cost? The environment, taxpayers, farmers, workers, and rural communities. As recent trade wars, the COVID-19 pandemic, and years of instability reveal cracks in our food system, grassroots support for supply management is growing across the countryside, and with good reason. Supply management can help restore the agricultural economy following a crippling global pandemic and economic downturn, just as it did after the Great Depression. Agriculture provides the food, fiber, and fuel that powers our society. It connects us to our environment and generates economic activity. Remember what thriving rural communities look like? We can have them, and supply management can help us get there. It's time to build a viable family farm economy for rural communities and all people.
All right. Wow, that video was really illuminating. I hope you all learned as much as I did. I don't know about the rest of you, but it certainly brought up a lot of questions for me. And for that, we'll go to our panelists. Remember that you can submit your questions in the Q&A. Oops, Daisy.
Oh, the listing says it's
You can submit your questions in the Q&A feature on your Zoom screen. So I want to start by asking you a question, Patty. Trump has been in office for over a month, and tariffs haven't hurt me yet. Why do we need a supply management strategy? Why are we talking about this?
Yeah, you probably heard the word tariffs quite a bit. The president has said it's one of his favorite words. So there's been a lot of talking about tariffs. Not a lot of them have actually gone into effect yet, is the short version. So there's been a lot of kind of making big pronouncements with extended timelines for when they kick in is the short version. So it's not 100% across the board. Like, so he at different points, the president has announced tariffs on Canada, Mexico, China. He gave a put pause on the Canada and Mexico. They went into effect for China. Then he's really every couple days rolling out new ideas of, you know, we're also going to do it on the European Union. And then there's also concepts of like, we're going to put tariffs on specific products, autos, no matter where they're from, you know, different metals, copper, like there's a lot of words and kind of threats of tariffs coming out. But the threat part is the important part because the desired effect, as much as it is like the tariff goes into effect and collects money, it is also kind of a negotiating tactic to be like, will this country come in and, you know, do something? So the Canada, Mexico, and China round, that early round was driven by his desire to have those countries come in and talk to the US about their plans on, you know, border security, fentanyl, things like that. So there's kind of different programs being run, but most of them haven't hit yet. The key thing for agriculture is, you know, most countries don't take that line down. If they are sending a product here and the tariffs go into effect and that product is more expensive, most countries will retaliate in some way. Agriculture is uniquely exposed to that retaliation in two ways. We import stuff. So we import fertilizer from Canada. The pork industry imports baby pigs from Canada. So as imports, they could be more expensive if you're paying the tariff on that import. And big parts of US agriculture are really dependent on exports because of the overproduction. We just saw in the video, right? So we have especially grains, you know, commodity crops, also meat. So a huge percentage, some people say it's 30% of the pork from the Midwest goes to export markets. So if a country, you know, that you need as your export customer is mad because they got hit with tariffs on what they send here, you know, your market might not be as attractive and they might find another seller, right? And that happened in the first Trump administration. You know, we got in a trade war with China and, you know, Brazil happily moved in to supply some of the need for corn or soybeans or whatever it is. So agriculture has to worry about what happens next after tariffs happen to imports because big parts of US agriculture are really out there in that export market. And if there is retaliation, it could be US ag that pays the price.
Gotcha. Tim, did you have anything you wanted to add there?
I mean, first of all, thank you to Wisconsin Farmers Union for making that video. It got rid of most of our talking points because it did such a good job of laying out both the issue and the solution. I think one thing we have to look backwards on is the last Census of Agriculture, which came out in 2023. It was from 2017 to 2023. It happens every 5 years. And the United States lost 141,000 farmers during those 5 years. And we lost 150,000 cattle operations. Missouri alone lost 10,000 cattle operations. Those are farmers just getting out, aging out, getting out, selling out, you know, or filing for bankruptcy and being forced out. So, you know, and we read a lot of ag media here. It's what we do. And let me tell you, in the mainstream ag media, nobody really is talking about the problems, the solutions, what is going on out in farm country. These major ag lobby groups, we all know who they are. They oftentimes speak for farmers, but they never ask questions of farmers or listen to farmers or really reflect what's going on out here. And then, you know, our job as a real farm group is to push for policies that will react to what's going on out here. And then those major ag groups push back against those policies. The reality is supply management would necessitate less government. It would necessitate less safety nets. It would necessitate more competition in markets and farmers getting paid a fair price and being able to stay on the farm and pass that farm down to the next generation. Here at MRCC, we talk about pork a lot because of, you know, we're a pork organization. We run Patrick Family Farms, and it's a similar way that they ran all the independent hog producers out of business by intentionally overproducing, vertically integrating so that they control multiple, if not all, parts of the supply chain. They can take losses here and there. They can charge consumers whatever they want because they control the entire market. But if they keep prices low by overproducing, it kicks all their competition out of the market, and their competition was independent family farm hog producers. And what's happening right now is happening in the grain markets, because this is, a dollar below cost of production. And who's making up sort of for that, these low prices, is taxpayers. We're footing the bill with government sponsored, revenue insurance, when what we could be doing is having a supply management program that doesn't lean on taxpayers, that supports farmers getting paid a fair wage, and then also has price ceilings, so it helps against price spikes for consumer prices. It's good for everyone. These are the policies that we've been fighting for literally decades. And like it said on the Wisconsin Farmers Union video right there, it was actually one of the main tenets of the original Farm Bill was supply management to not only ensure farmers get paid, but also that our environment doesn't suffer due to overproduction. And there was one question in there, what bill did Bill Clinton sign? It was the Farm Bill in 1996. It was called the Freedom to Farm Bill. It got quickly recoined the Freedom to Fail Bill. And the reason it got quickly renamed that out here in farm country is because it got rid of the last vestige of supply management.
Yeah, okay, understood. I did want to follow up with you real quick, just in case we have viewers who don't know a lot about it. Can you really quickly just, and I know it's really hard because it's a huge thing, but can you really quickly just explain what a farm bill is?
Me too.
Either
Okay.
one of you.
I can start. So a lot of what we do that sets up the rules for federal farm policy, not everything, there's other mechanisms, but a lot of it happens roughly every 5 years with a bill we call a farm bill. It's a big package. So there's stuff in there about, how much money will go to research, crop disease, how much money will go, the Forest Service is in there because they're part of the Department of Agriculture. But the key moving parts for this conversation, and it's the first section, they call it Title I of the bill every 5 years, is the commodity title. So what the government programs are going to be for the commodity crops, corn, soy, wheat, rice, cotton, there's some more, but dairy is a big one. Those rules are set when the Congress passes the new farm bill. It's hard to do. There's a reason they don't do it every year. They wouldn't get it done. They're struggling to get it done now. We're 2 years late on the 5-year farm bill cycle. So if we're thinking about the history of like this concept of, the government being involved in these markets to manage the supply of the commodities to avoid being, and this kind of gets back to the first question, like we are vulnerable to all of these trade attacks because we have so much product, we have to export it. And that makes you vulnerable to retaliation in a trade war, right? One way to be less vulnerable is to not be so dependent on exports and to grow the right amount that you could sell it domestically, right? That would be a smarter place to be. And in the New Deal, supply management era, we would tweak those programs every 5 years or so in a farm bill. If you kind of made a timeline of like supply management, how it performed, and it worked this way for a while. It changed in 5-year increments, kind of as new farm bills were passed. They started chipping away with it from like the Nixon era through the Reagan era, really started taking the pieces away, and kind of the last piece of it, which was the concept of having a grain reserve that the government runs, where if you have a bumper crop, you put some in reserve to keep it from crashing prices. And then also the next year might be a drought. The next year you might need that crop and you have it, right? We had that for many decades. The last time the government ran a grain reserve was that 1996 Farm Bill took that away. We've been kind of living with the chaos of not having reserves ever since. So that's the place where this policy gets written, is the Farm Bill.
Okay, that sounds like the supply management sounds like it could be really important both for economic security, but also food security, just having those reserves on hand. So my next question also kind of dovetails with Darvin's question. If we were to implement a supply management strategy today, what would that look like?
Tim, you want me to start?
Yeah, you can go ahead. I just want to say food
Yep.
security is national security as well. So I just want
Absolutely.
those are
Yep.
hand in hand.
So there's different ways. So the concept of supply management is literally just the concept that there is government involvement in saying enough. right? And then dealing with his tendency, like the video did a great job of demonstrating, like the individual farmer tendency to just grow more. If the prices are bad, I better have more of it to sell. And when you add that up, it's disastrous, right? So the concept of supply management is saying there's some central coordination happening to like deal with that trend. You can do it in different ways. The CFFE groups and MRCC and MRCC folks were super valuable in these conversations and like mapping out those options. And we worked with an economist to kind of look at the ways you could do it. And we landed on a concept of the reserve. The concept of a grain reserve is really critical at the middle of it. So it's a great year. Everybody had a bumper crop. There's a floor, there's a line tied to the cost of production where if the market is terrible, the prices are terrible because there's so much crop, you can give it to the reserve. You can sell it to the reserve for this minimum price. You'll at least get paid this, right? And the price won't be a catastrophe because everybody knows, if you go below that price, no one's going to sell to you. They're going to put it in the reserve. You do have to put a limit on that or you're going to be building buildings to store grain in forever, right? And so the way you deal with the flip side of that, so you're not just constantly buying grain and putting it in the reserve because there's nothing saying slow down, is you do have to have some mechanism to say you can have that protection, right? You can have that price floor protection if you do something to make sure we're not just going wild and producing too much. There's different ways to do that. Kind of the language you hear, and I think that's even in the question from Darvin, is to set aside. Like you need to set aside some of your capacity as a farmer to not be putting more of this crop on the market. You could physically set it aside by putting it in like the conservation reserve program and being like, I'm not going to farm 10% of my acres. We talked a lot about modernizing the concept for today. And we didn't think it had to be that rigid of like, we're going to come to your farm and be like, show us the acres you pulled out of production. That was one style of this, decades ago. We think we could have more flexibility and you could do other stuff with your farm as long as those efforts aren't putting these covered crops on the market. So if that means you want to, have some of your production be pastured livestock, you want to shift some of your acres to an orchard, you want to start experimenting with perennial grains, that you don't, or you want to raise grain and feed it to animals and you're not selling it and putting on the market, knock yourself out, right? It doesn't have to look like, the heavy government control, but the net effect is we've done the modeling. We know we need this for this marketplace. This is your piece of the action. You can get that price floor protection for that piece of the action. And that means you're only going to put this much on the market. How you get there is up to you, right? And to do that, we need to accompany that with lots of stuff. We need antitrust, so there's more than 2 buyers in your neighborhood, right? We need research to help people do perennial grains or bring livestock back in their farm. We need crop insurance that works for all of that, not just a couple big crops, right? We need to wrap around the services to help people have more diverse farms and not just be in like the corn and bean treadmill. But we could do that based on the modeling of like, this is the right amount so everybody can get a good price and you get these protections if you participate in the overall coordination. And then the final piece of that, that I'll say is we do a form of this. If people forget about this, we do this kind of sorta for sugar. So and there's lots of those wraparound pieces of like that level of coordination. We deal with our imports. So we can't just have somebody importing cheap corn that blows up the whole system because that industry chooses to maintain that system. They go to that farm bill every 5 years and they fight like hell to keep it because it's keeping their members in business. So there's a lot of like hand wringing about, oh, the government, and is it their job? And like the sugar industry is like, yes, it is. We would like to continue it.
And like Patty said, if Patty said this, the government is already hugely involved in these markets. And actually the part of the government that's even most involved in these markets is us as taxpayers, because we're footing the bill in billions and billions of dollars in order to help farmers sort of be whole because of low prices like this 460 corn back here. What this would do is actually create a referee in the market a little bit, and that goes back to antitrust as well. I'm a believer that if you have antitrust enforcement, and I think this is sort of a form of antitrust enforcement, that you actually need less government because there's more competition out here. You need less safety nets. People are getting paid a more fair wage across the board because a bunch of buyers and sellers out here are competing against each other as opposed to just one buyer and or one seller who's trying to extract all the wealth out of the commodity and the market as possible. And the issue with this also is a bigger issue of like, who does our democratic process really represent? Does it represent us, the people and taxpayers, or does it represent special interests in the lobbyists that are actually writing these rules? And right now, I would argue that in large part, our democratic process does the latter. It represents these big multinational corporations because the reality is the more control they get over these markets, the more control they can have over a democratic process. And the more control they can have over a democratic process, the more power they have to take over the markets even more. And and their goal, and if there's no referee out here doing nothing, it's going to go this way. Their goal is to pay producers less and charge consumers as much as they can charge them so that they can make as much money as possible. And that's actually sort of their fiduciary responsibilities to make as much money as possible. But that's the purpose of a democratic process in order to create rules so that there's fairness out here.
Absolutely. Okay, so I wanted to ask this question, and we're almost out of time. So if we could keep it brief, I wanted to get to this question because we hear this so very often in the argument for the big ag. What impact would supply management have on hungry people in drought impacted areas of underdeveloped countries? And I would like to tack on my own question to that. We have that question just straight away, but then added to that with the canceling of the USAID contracts that were providing a lot of that grain. What does that look like? Can you tell us a little bit about that, Patty?
Yeah, so I mean, reserves are a part of that answer. So this gets complicated. I am grossly oversimplifying, right? This is worthy of its own webinar, but there are multiple things. There are multiple programs that are run under U.S. Agency for International Development, and there's multiple kind of pieces of narrative at play here about which food gets sent where and why. And there is a chunk, not all, there is a role for, relief, right? Humanitarian relief. There is a country that had a drought, a war, an earthquake, and they cannot feed themselves. And so us having a reserve, like one of the purposes of us having a grain reserve could be to have some supply because somebody needs it. And we put it on a boat and we get it there because they're having trouble feeding themselves. We actually don't have that right now. We buy it off the market and send it. But that is not all that's happening with international food aid. Unfortunately, we are also using it as an outlet for our overproduction, and it can wreck the farm economies of the recipient country. That's not all of it. There is help being sent by the US government where help is needed, but there is also dumping, right? And that's kind of the international trade phrase you hear about, like, a boat is arriving with US produced product that is either being donated or sold at a price that undercuts local farmers who have something to sell. Like, that's the missing piece of all this, is that it's only going to places where there is nothing there to eat. Sometimes there's something there to eat, but people don't have the money to buy it. So there's been lots of efforts over the years of, like, it might be more helpful in some circumstances to send money than to send our, overproduced, pretty inexpensive grain because of all of the US subsidies and things that play into it. So it's not to say zero, we shouldn't send anything, but we are using that as an outlet for our overproduction, and it has done harm to farmers in some markets around the world. And it's worthy of a much better discussion than we're getting right now. We're getting, and this is part of, like, we have to produce this much because American farmers feed the world. Lots of the world can feed itself and would like to. And instead we have big agribusiness, like, arriving with our overproduced stuff.
Yeah, feed the world and free trade not only negatively impacts U.S. farmers, has negatively impacted U.S. farmers, but also puts farmers out of business around the world. When we talk about immigration in this country, we very rarely talk about NAFTA and how we dumped subsidized, overproduced corn on their marketplace. One of their main crops was corn, and it put if not millions of farmers out of business. And what we know is from the hog market and from the cattle market and from, I'm looking at a map of Missouri over here, is that the ripple effect of when you put farmers out of business, the small businesses that support farmers and production of food also gets hit really, really hard. And I think we see that in our rural communities here in Missouri and across our country, but it's happening all around the world. The Feed the World narrative is actually about putting farmers out of business, which doesn't make any sense. Our goal should be to have more farmers. And here, and we didn't talk about this either, but I think it's an important thing. We want to see livestock on the ground. And right now people are cycling out of livestock and buying up larger acreages and putting corn and beans and wheat cycles on the ground. And we want to see more cattle on the ground, and that's a separate conversation. It's actually a conversation we probably had a couple of years ago on one of these webinars. We could talk about that further. But we want to see more cattle on the ground. We want to see more hogs that are raised by independent family farmers. And the reason we're here right now talking about this is because we've had bad policy that's written by corporations. And as family farm groups that understand history, we know what the good policies are that will create a solution and be ideally a resurgence of family farm agriculture here in Missouri, across our country, and across our world.
Okay, thank you for that. And then I've got another question. Would a supply management strategy like the one that we've discussed, would this cost taxpayers a lot of money?
It wouldn't cost zero, right? Nothing is free. But we actually worked with an economist a couple of years ago to do some models, and we did different scenarios and things like that. And in most of the scenarios, that grain reserve we talked about, where there's some strings attached, you can't just keep selling to the reserve forever. That there was some requirements of, like, if you take the deal of the price floor, you have to dial it back, and reduce in some way. And in most of the scenarios, it was cheaper than what we do now in terms of government expenditures, because what we do now is very unpredictable because we have big swings, we have booms and busts, right? And prices are great. The farm bill commodity payments don't need to go out. The market is paying, but there's enough years, and increasingly lately more years, where it isn't, right? The prices aren't good enough, and those commodity programs pay out. Every farm bill cycle, every 5 years, we seem to change the name of it. And sometimes it's a direct payment, sometimes it's an emergency payment. Mostly now it's subsidizing farmers to buy crop insurance to try to guess the best level of coverage to ensure their revenue. That costs a lot of money. We're spending that now most years, right? More often than not. That's all the fights about this farm bill about, like, are those programs paying out enough? So in the modeling that we did, the predictability and, like, taking out the huge swings, the huge volatility, yes, you would pay some money to maintain those reserves. You would pay some money for the rest of these services, but it could be cheaper. And it would be a lot more predictable for farmers to plan their business, right? To, like, pass it on and, like, have some stability. There would be a lot of those kind of benefits, and it wouldn't have to cost more.
Okay. Well, I like that answer. I like the idea that it might save us a little bit of money to do things a little bit smarter. All right, so it looks like we're a little bit over time. I want to thank everybody for hanging in there with us so well. I hope you all feel a little bit more well-versed in supply management than you did before. If you have any more questions, you can reach out to me at jamie@morural.org. And I want to thank you all for joining us. And a big thank you to Tim and Patty for answering our questions today. Thanks so much, guys.
Hey, thank you, Jamie. Thank you, Patty. Well done, y'all.